Crisis Radio, calling your attention as always to Tarpley.net. You ought to catch up on that story of December 23rd, 1310, with Dante's candidate for Holy Roman Emperor and for sovereign of northern Italy, arriving in Milan and setting up the Visconti dynasty, which then, several decades later, went on to produce the first prototype of the modern state, and many other recent interviews on the Obama birth certificate issue, interviews on WikiLeaks and Assange and the latest CIA limited hangout operations, all of that to be found at Tarpley.net. So here we are. We're on the eve of the Gopocalypse. A gang of ogres are coming to town, right? These Vikings that you see in the Capital One commercials would be a useful comparison, except it's much more sinister. So they're coming to town. Now, we look back at 2010. What can we say about the progress of the Depression? It is the year the Depression came to Europe. Let's just recall the basic framework of comparison that we have is to compare the current world economic depression, breakdown crisis, and disintegration of the imperialist world order with what you had in 1929 to 1931. And in those days, remember, we had the New York stock market crash of October 1929, and then a period of 1 to 1.5 years of relatively less apocalyptic activity, less crash. But then, in the spring of 1931, we had the Austrian banking crisis, soon followed by the entire Central and Eastern European banking crisis. Highlight of that was the collapse of the German banking system in June and July of 1931, and that then turned into the collapse of the Dutch banks, and then the collapse of the British pound, the bankruptcy of the British pound sterling, default on gold payment by the Bank of England, September 21st, 1931. And remember, that's the central event of the world economic depression of those days. That's what destroyed world trade, not Holy Smoot, because this is what destroyed the only world currency system that there was. Now, after 1931, that was the second phase, the collapse of Europe, the second phase. The third phase then became a banking panic inside the United States, which took up the whole year of 1932 into 1933, such that on the eve of Franklin D. Roosevelt's inauguration, every bank had shut down. He didn't shut down any of them. They were already shut down. The free market, so to speak, had shut them down, and nobody had succeeded in opening them up. So he was basically giving them legal cover with the bank holiday. So 3 waves, right? The immediate stock market panic, then the European banking crash, and then coming back to the United States in the form of a banking panic. So let's look at what we had. In September and October of 2008, we had the New York banking panic, a run on the zombie banks. Obviously, all of them bankrupt. The cases of Lehman Brothers, AIG, and Merrill Lynch, but really all of them, be it J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citibank, all the rest of them, thoroughly bankrupt. Bankrupted by what? Well, generally by credit default swaps in the case of AIG, but of collateralized debt obligations in the case of most of the others, based at several removes on, in some cases, on subprime, but also on auto loans and credit card loans and so forth. So we are following, in a general way, there's a rough parallel between what happened in 29 to 31 and what we've seen now over the last almost 2.5 years. So remember, in 2009, we had helicopter Ben Bernanke flooding the dollar system with plenty of cheap credit, right, liquidity injections, to the tune of an open credit line of $24 trillion in theory, and as they now claim, $3.3 trillion actually lent out to various zombie institutions. And remember, you had to be a financial parasite in order to qualify. If you produced anything, you were immediately disqualified. So the whole system, the reverse of what it ought to be in reality. as a result of the $24 trillion line of credit open and the $3.3 trillion actually lent out, the dollar tended to fall all during 2009. And by August, September 2009, you can look on my website, you can see a commentary I did for Russia Today in August of 2009 that the dollar was in danger of some kind of a very, very sickening downward lurch, with the possibility then of hyperinflation. Remember, hyperinflation is a foreign exchange event, and it's often caused by economic warfare. Then in November 2009, we had this Dubai crisis around the time of Thanksgiving, and this began to turn the situation around. That is, after the contagion, so to speak, had hit Dubai, it then turned back towards Europe, and the dollar hit its 2009 low around December 1st, give or take a couple of weeks perhaps. After that, the dollar began to strengthen precisely on the rumors that a sovereign debt crisis was coming to Europe. In other words, the European countries which had gone very, very far down the road to bail out the zombie banks of that continent and the derivatives mongers of that continent, they were also then groaning under the increased social expenditure of more unemployed, more need for social services as the Depression hit. And we had in February 2010 that infamous idea dinner. Again, read about it at tarpley.net, all written up. The idea dinner reported by the Wall Street Journal at Moness, Crespi, and Hart, where we had leading hedge fund hyenas from the U.S. side, including the Soros interests, getting together to figure out how can you attack the euro? Well, you can't do it directly. You got to do it through some weak flanks and some chinks in the armor, and that would be the Greek government bond market, the Spanish, Portuguese, some other government bond market. So this then became the big theme of the springtime, was a speculative attack on the euro, engineered, of course, for money in the narrow sense, but also from a strategic point of view, in order to shift the crisis from the dollar over to the euro. Beggar my neighbor, export the depression, competitive devaluation of the dollar. And that campaign that began in the very early days of 2010 or end of 2009 peaked around May, June, with the low point of the euro being reached at that point. Now, remember, this is also the flash crash. My thesis is that the flash crash of May 6th is not what various SEC and CFTC say it was, but rather was a figment. It was a boomerang effect of an attack on the euro. If you look at that flash crash day, not only did the Dow go down by 1,000 points in about 10 minutes, quite breathtaking if you lived through it, as I was interested enough to do, but the euro was crashing down against the yen markedly. So what they found was they could crash the euro, but they'd be crashing New York at the same time, and that wouldn't really serve their purpose. So they relented, and that's the story of May 6th. We'll continue this retrospective in just a minute.